Welcome to Essential Dynamics. I'm your host, Eric Hudson. The Essential Dynamics podcast gives us the opportunity to explore the ideas that we've been developing and call Essential Dynamics. We're doing this so we can help people and organizations work through tricky problems and improve their performance. Today, I have my colleague, Dave Kane, with me. Dave, welcome to Essential Dynamics again.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, good to be back.
So, Dave, we've been at our firm Unconstrained, we've been trying to raise the level of the conversation a little bit. One of the things we've been doing is putting some blogs out there, and I understand there's one that you want to dig into today.
Well, yeah, one of the more recent ones you put out there was getting around to building the better birdhouse, and it was a really interesting analogy. And so I've kind of been reflecting on that for about a week here since I've read it, and there's a couple kind of paths I think I'd like to go down and just sort of get your thoughts on and sort of dig into a little bit. And the first of which being is, why is this so hard? And what are some tips to help get us, more successful at it? But maybe to start with, for context, do you just want to give a bit of an overview of what I read so others can follow?
Yeah. So the blog is called You Better Build a Birdhouse. And it came to me just as I was thinking about the performance initiatives, the improvement initiatives that organizations try, and how when we deal with things that are more tangible, it's really obvious whether we're successful or not. And so the story I tell in the blog is about a family that has a beautiful backyard and a beautiful neighborhood. And there's a lot of birds and songbirds singing, but the daughter in this family feels like the birds don't come into their yard. And she finds out at school one day, if you build the right kind of birdhouse, you can have robins nest in your yard. And so she tells her dad about it. And so here's the thing. The only successful outcome of that project is if dad helps the girl build a birdhouse.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about the improvements that you want to do in an organization, and you can come up with ideas in a lot of different ways. A lot of times we don't get anywhere close to, actually building a birdhouse and doing something tangible and useful. And so I'm just trying to put it out there that, hey, before we start any of these initiatives, let's get really clear on the problem we're trying to solve, really clear on the planned course of action, like our hypothesis as to how we're going to solve the problem, and then do it, and then see if it works. It seems obvious, but there's a big difference between putting a birdhouse up in the backyard and watching for the birds to nest, and talking about birdhouses and having pictures of birdhouses and sketches of birdhouses. And so you better build a birdhouse.
Yeah, no, what I really liked about it, because I made the connection of, getting around to actually building the birdhouse in an organization should be, getting around to changing the system that you're generating value with. And so I sort of kept jumping back and forth between building a birdhouse and working with this family or doing it within a company. But even as a starting point, you follow Essential Dynamics and you always talk about your quest. And I really enjoy this one because, the father is suddenly on a quest to go build a birdhouse and get robins in his yard. And he's on this epic journey that, he didn't sign up for, and suddenly it's been thrust upon him, and he's got all sorts of different motivations to succeed. So I kind of like that. But so why is it so hard? Like, why is it that hard to translate the plan and the idea into getting the right thing done?
Well, I would say it starts with we often are not clear on our purpose. And, we talk about systems and we talk about the flow in a system, but it starts with it's designed to accomplish something. And if we're not clear on that, there's no amount of improvement of the system that's going to make a difference if we're not clear on what we want to do. I'm really dating myself because I do remember the Pogo comic strip in the newspaper.
I don't.
But it's one of the one of the lines from that, and I don't remember as a kid, but was having lost sight of our objective, let us redouble our efforts.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no value in improvement, in grit, in putting your back into it and extra energy if you're not clear what you're trying to accomplish. And
Right.
and so the birdhouse analogy, it's interesting because I talk about building a birdhouse, but that's not the ultimate objective here. And I don't know that I did this on purpose, but in the conversation between the father and the daughter, the ultimate objective is songbirds in the yard because they sound nice and it's nice to have them.
Mm-hmm.
And the hypothesis is, well, if they had a place to nest in their yard, they're more likely to come. The nice thing about the birdhouse is it's completely within the control of the management team here, which is the father and the daughter.
Right.
So their hypothesis is if we build a birdhouse, then the birds will nest in our yard and we'll have birds in our yard.
Okay, so that was sort of my second question. So let's sort of park the why that's so hard for a second, just figure out why do we know this is the right one to do first? Because there's a lot of other things I could do in order to get songbirds into the yard. I could add some bird seed, or I could throw worms all over the yard. Like there's other things that could be done, and so quite often, it's because this opportunity was presented or somebody came to you with this idea, suddenly it's the right one to do. How do you know that the birdhouse is the right way to go? Because somebody could have knocked on the door and said, well, here's some bird seed we're selling, as opposed to somebody gave her an idea to build a birdhouse.
You're talking about the consulting industry that I'm trying to say somehow distinct from when I need to. Yeah, so that's a good point.
Well, there's that. Yes, there's the solution looking for a problem. There's also, even with, say, some of the federal grants, right? It's, hey, everybody needs to go build a digital website and here's some money to go do it. How do I know that's the right one? And I have my views, but
well, okay. So we talked about, let's get clear on a purpose. And then once we're clear on a purpose, and we need a system to accomplish that, or to create value. Mm-hmm. There are steps in that process that move you forward. There are things that get in the way. You need to understand that, because any improvement outside that critical path doesn't make things better. And so, for example, let's try this one. This is a really obvious one. So I was in a conversation online a couple of days ago with a high school friend of mine who had a heart attack, and he's far away in the United States and he's recovering. And I empathize because 22 years ago I had a heart attack. When I went into the hospital, the trauma team, the paramedics had picked me up and they did a quick diagnosis and they brought me in, and then it was time for an angiogram to confirm the diagnosis. And the nice thing about angiograms is once you're there, they do the therapy right away. They leave a stent inside. I have other health problems. I have bad knees and bad vision. I'm not very flexible. Probably should weigh a little bit less. But in that moment, it's pretty clear that I need a stent in my artery. And any other improvement isn't even an improvement, doesn't even matter. And so one of the problems we have in these complex systems is we think any improvement is an improvement. And what we need to try to understand, and it's not obvious, but to try to understand what's an improvement that's going to matter. It's actually going to increase the flow of value. So you may not actually know. So the bird seed is a good example. Maybe there's colors that birds are attracted to. You could put out in your backyard. But here's the thing: you build a birdhouse and then you see if birds come.
I agree. I think there's an easy check before you go. Like, certainly trying something is better than waiting and analyzing even more, right? Because you're building a hypothesis and you can go out and you can try something and you get some improvement, or you figure out what the next thing to fix is. And so I agree that, especially if it's a stint and that sort of thing, doing something is better than doing nothing.
Yeah.
But I think when time allows, it's much easier to do a quick assessment back to, you sort of said, your purpose X and your purpose Y. And so it's the birdhouse example, your purpose X is to get songbirds in the yard, and purpose Y is probably you're trying to teach your daughter to do it, responsibly, financially, and both sustainably, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you look at your other alternatives, I could go buy seed, but then I have to keep buying seed in order to keep them coming. So you've developed a model where I have to keep throwing money at it. So maybe that's not the best outcome. And then there's also these undesirable effects that may also come of it. You could go with the seed, and that may just attract a bunch of birds that scare the robins away. Right?
That's
so
right.
if you look at your purpose X and your purpose Y,
yeah,
you could screen it quite quickly and figure, well, building a birdhouse is specific to the robins and the songbirds I want. So that's probably the best alternative to start with.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we can do those thought experiments. And it's what I find interesting is, although we have the capacity to do a lot of detailed analysis, and you and I are both pretty strong in our spreadsheet game, and that's been kind of overtaken by things like Power BI and big data. And, I'll pass beyond that to machine learning and things. But there's a lot of value in a cause effect kind of diagram, and if then, and looking at the things. And what if we put seed in our backyard? Well, the magpies will come and eat it all.
Yeah.
And so if you want magpies, then if you want any kind of birds, that's fine. You branch off of that and say, well, what kind of birds do we want and what attracts those birds? And as this girl learned in school, there's a particular kind of birdhouse, not the kind that we would think of, that robins like. And so and there's some good information out there about what they like. And so that's a reasonable hypothesis. It might not always work, but and I also like that you put on the additional criteria like sustainability, and then you scrap materials for birdhouse, build it once, you're good.
Yeah,
you don't have to pay the software as a service model. And to have Uber Eats bring your
birdseed every
your
month.
Birdseed. Yeah, that's right.
So how does that translate to doing it at a business? Is this like a decision tree you're looking at, or how are you looking at, the quick consideration of what the other outcomes may be if you pursue this path?
Yeah, decision tree is a good way to look at it. I certainly have used, various techniques, just a little bit of flow chart. In the theory of constraints, there's the future reality tree, which is actually more about implementation, and the current reality tree, which is about what the heck is happening. And it's really focused on getting to root cause, which I think is, obviously good in the case of the bird. Like, why don't we have birds in our yard? Your analysis might show that your cat is the constraint.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And you can build all the birdhouses you want as long as you have a feral cat in the backyard, then you're not going to have any birds.
Right.
And so sometimes that's obvious and sometimes it takes a little bit of work, but, just without, picking a specific tool, my experience has been being clear about the goal that you want, and then having multiple voices, multiple sets of eyes looking at the situation, the reality, and considering what's happening is valuable. I have been in meetings where the boss just told us what was going to happen, and sometimes the boss was right and sometimes the boss was wrong. I've also been in meetings where the boss had an angle and then tried to get it out of the group. That's never a good idea.
Hey, there's an answer he was trying to draw out.
Yeah. That's never a good idea. You got to, the way I like it is we're looking for truth here, and truth will stand on its own and it can come from anywhere. So let's get some multiple voices in the room and try and understand cause and effect, both what we see and what we intend to see, and put those things out there. I think it's way more about being clear on the purpose and understanding the flow of the system at a high level. So where I see this breakdown in organizations is people just do stuff because they think it's a good idea. Or they're siloed already, and so they're doing stuff to optimize locally when we really should be looking at the system overall.
Right. They think these are the pieces they can affect. And so in their mind, doing something is better than doing nothing. But yeah, I've heard it enough times on the podcast from others. You could even just simplify it to being, you're just taking a step back and having all the voices in the conversation take that system view, and just sort of, you don't have to get too complicated into how you do a decision tree or other things, but it's just taking that moment to sort of align it to, how does this align to our purposes? And if we do this, what might be the consequence or what might be the outcome? And then evaluating which alternative is going to be easier. So, I mean, there's more complicated ways to do it, but in the Birdhouse with the daughter, it might just be a quick conversation.
Yeah. I think that what we struggle with a lot of times in business is that we really like complexity. Like we really like sophistication. We really like lots of data. And so that the solution has to have those elements. And when we look at a system that there's flow, or there's supposed to be flow to create value, we know that somewhere in there's one step that's can't keep up with the other ones, and that's the constraint. We also know that and it might be that, or it might be something else that should be the constraint. And it should be the constraint because it's the hardest thing. It uses the most expensive equipment, or the most skilled work, or it's the most intricate, or whatever. And so we need to organize our system around that. And if you can increase the flow through the constraint, you'll see it come out the other end. But we don't think that way most of the time. We think if I can improve over here or over there, it's an improvement, so it should flow through. But
yeah, anything I can do to improve it should make a difference. But I always like looking at it as, it's like a hose, and there's one big squeeze on the hose, and you can go and take all the other kinks out of it, but that's not going to increase what's coming out the other end.
Well, that was my experience 22 years ago, Dave. Yeah.
with the hose?
With the hose in my heart. Yes.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Stint. Yeah.
Yeah. You've got to open it up. You got to open up the flow, and then you're going to be surprised by the next blockage.
Right. Well, it'll either reveal itself by the flow didn't increase and you can go downstream and figure out what's next, or if potentially it's upstream. Like, how do you know?
Yeah. And so one way to know is to, take the one constraint out and then see what happens. And that's the other way to do it, is to ask yourself a bunch of questions and say, when that's not the constraint, what is? Now, it's really possible. I think this is worth talking about for a minute, is that sometimes, because we're not thinking of a systems view, and we tend to work at the local levels and then assume the system's going to be fine on its own, that we have a system that's not stable. It's in chaos. And so the constraint bounces around all over the place. And you can't see what's going on. And so you have to make a judgment and say, well, I think this is one problem we know. Let's give that part more capacity. And that takes it off the list, the first thing. But the second thing is it might start to reveal what your real constraint is. And I read a really interesting article a while back. It was a software company. They're developing software, and they were onto something, but it was going to be a while before they even had customers. But the owner who was writing the article said, I came to only accept a constraint if it wasn't something I could solve easily with money, because you needed to find the real constraint. But business is hard enough. Things are complicated enough that if you also constrain it with making uneconomical, cheapskate decisions, you put more constraints on your system than you need to have. And I've gone through this a bunch of different ways, with home repairs and stuff like that. And finally, when I get my head around it, just get the professional in, pay the money. I never have to think about it again.
Right.
Whereas you're trying to accommodate this, one limitation in your system all the time. It's taking so much time and attention, and you just solve it and it's fine. And I mean, I worked with a client who was in a situation kind of like that. And then they got their head around what the value would be of like the second piece of equipment, because it was expensive and they didn't want to spend the money.
Right.
But they get the expensive piece of equipment. They pay for it in like literally weeks of increased flow. It's not used all the time, but when it's used, that increased flow, that problem like never manifests itself again, and you can go on and run the rest of the business. But so you can kind of cheap out and leave constraints in the system that don't need to be there. And I think there's something to that in our minds as well. We fuss about things that we don't need to fuss about.
Right.
And if you could solve it once and for all. So, I mean, in this conversation, I don't want to minimize the complexity of organizations and, the job that leaders have, but we don't have to make it more complicated than it really is. And so anytime we can step back and say, oh, actually, if we just built a birdhouse, it would be better. That's step one. And then step two is you got to build a birdhouse.
Yeah. So what I've sort of heard though is there's I don't know, a bit of a balance or it's a challenge here, because you've sort of said on one hand, it's certainly better to do something based upon your best hypothesis of what you think, and then you will learn from it. And then that sort of bias for action is working towards improvement. But ahead of that, you do need to at least look at these against your purpose, path, and people, and sort of screen things out to understand which outcome is going to get you where you want to be, which are going to have these undesirable effects. So there's this balance between, you do need to step back and do a little bit of thinking with that bias for action still there. It's like you just still want to start shooting off at different constraints.
Absolutely. You want to try and stabilize the system, and the mental effort is kind of the least expensive thing that you can do. So take the mental effort. And so perhaps the next time we get together, we can talk a little bit more about that and how, because I know you want to get to the sort of the people side and the path side of that as well.
I do. And I still kind of have my question I opened up with of why is it so hard? I mean, I've gotten a better discussion here on why this one first. And so that really helps, but I still have a few questions and thoughts for you on why it's so hard and how do we merge that into the purpose, path, and people to make it effective. So,
well, do we want to pick that up next time then? Why is it so hard?
Probably better than squeezing it in. So let's carry it for a week and bring it back to this question later.
Okay. Well, okay. I will say this though. We can ask why is it hard in a particular case, but the essential dynamics establishes with this idea of the quest that if it wasn't hard, it wouldn't be worth talking about. So don't be surprised that it's hard, but yeah, let's understand why is it hard.
Sounds terrific.
Okay. Hey, thanks very much. So on this episode, Dave asked the questions. Derek didn't do a good job of answering. And so we're going to try it again next time.
We'll spin it around. Yep.
So Dave Kane from Unconstrained, thanks for being with me today. Bryn Griffiths, thanks for being in the background, making us sound better than we are. And until next time, consider your quest.